The rain poured down in thick sheets, drumming against the rooftop of the grand estate. Daniel Carter stood by the window, watching the storm rage outside, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of a faded photograph in his hand. It was a picture of his late mother. Her gentle smile, the way she held him close when he was a child. It had been years since he lost her, but the pain never truly faded. His heart ached for the warmth of family, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Despite his wealth and success, Daniel had built an empire from the ground up. From an orphan with nothing to a self-made millionaire, he had proven everyone wrong. Yet, even with all his achievements, he often found himself feeling empty. No amount of money could fill the void left by the family he had lost. He had no siblings, no close relatives. At least that's what he thought. But all of that changed one fateful afternoon. Daniel had been visiting a local orphanage for a charity event, something he regularly did to give back. He had spent part of his childhood in a place just like this, and he understood the loneliness those children felt. He walked through the halls, greeting the kids, handing out small gifts, and donating generously to their future. But as he turned a corner, his breath caught in his throat. Standing just a few feet away was a young boy, no older than 10, staring right back at him. And the strangest part, the boy looked exactly like him. It wasn't just a passing resemblance. The boy had the same sharp nose, the same deep brown eyes, the same slight dimple on his left cheek when he blinked in surprise. It was as if Daniel was looking into a mirror from the past, seeing himself as a child once more. A chill ran down his spine. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The boy's eyes were filled with a mix of curiosity and uncertainty, as if he, too, sensed something unusual about this moment. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. Was this some sort of coincidence? An odd trick of genetics? His mind raced with possibilities, but before he could even process what he was seeing, his gaze dropped to the boy's neck. Hanging from a thin, worn-out chain was a necklace, one that Daniel knew all too well, his mother's necklace. The same delicate pendant she had worn every single day until her passing. The same one that should have been buried with her, never to be seen again. Daniel felt the air leave his lungs. This was impossible. How did this child have his mother's necklace? And why did he look exactly like him? 1,000 questions swirled in his mind, but none of them made sense. He took a cautious step forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where did you get that necklace?" The boy instinctively clutched the pendant, as if afraid it might be taken away from him. His lips parted, but no words came out. Behind him, the head caretaker of the orphanage, Mrs. Thompson, noticed the interaction and stepped in. "Ah, I see you've met Oliver," she said with a gentle smile, though her eyes flickered with slight concern at the tension in the air. "He's been here since he was a baby. Poor thing was left at our doorstep with nothing but that necklace." Daniel's heart stopped. Left at the doorstep with that necklace. His hands clenched into fists as a storm of emotions crashed over him. This wasn't just a coincidence. This wasn't random. There was something much deeper at play, and he was going to find out the truth. Daniel couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling that something bigger was at play. His mind raced with questions, each more unsettling than the last. How was it possible that this boy, a complete stranger, looked exactly like him? And that necklace, his mother's necklace, how did Oliver have it when it should have been buried with her? He turned to Mrs. Thompson, trying to keep his voice steady. "You said he was left here as a baby." She nodded, folding her hands in front of her. "Yes, I remember the night it happened. It was a stormy evening, much like today. I heard crying outside the front door, and when I opened it, there he was, wrapped in an old blanket, barely a few days old. No note, no explanation, just that necklace around his tiny neck. She sighed, her expression softening. We tried everything to find out where he came from, but no one ever claimed him. He's been here ever since. Daniel's jaw tightened. That timeline didn't add up. If Oliver was 10 now, that meant he was abandoned a decade ago. The same year Daniel's mother passed away. The realization sent a chill down his spine. He knelt in front of Oliver, meeting his eyes. Do you remember anything about your family? Anything at all? The boy hesitated, his fingers still curled around the pendant. No, he murmured. I just remember always having this. He looked down at the necklace, rubbing it between his fingers as if it gave him comfort. It's the only thing I have from before. The word lingered in Daniel's mind. Something about this wasn't right, and he had to find out what. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He kept replaying everything in his head, trying to connect the dots. He dug through old photos, searching for any detail he might have overlooked. His mother had always been secretive about the past, but surely there had to be something. A clue? A missing piece. Then he found it, an old faded photograph tucked away in a box of memories. It showed his mother holding him as a toddler, but what caught his attention wasn't them. It was the man standing in the background, a man Daniel didn't recognize. Yet something about him felt eerily familiar. The next morning, Daniel returned to the orphanage with a mission. He needed answers. He sat down with Mrs. Thompson, showing her the photograph. Do you know this man? Her expression shifted, eyes narrowing as she studied the image. And then, just for a second, her face paled. I think so, she said slowly. He used to come by years ago, asking about Oliver. He never said who he was, just that he wanted to check on him. I assumed he was a relative, but he never came inside. Then, one day, he stopped coming altogether. Daniel's heart pounded. Do you remember his name? Mrs. Thompson shook her head. No, but I might have some records from back then. She led him to a dusty filing cabinet in the back of the office, flipping through old documents. After a few moments, she pulled out a worn folder. Here. This is from the time Oliver was left here. Daniel scanned the file, his eyes moving quickly over the papers. Medical records, intake notes. And then he saw it. A single line scribbled at the bottom of a report. Infant was left with a silver necklace. Unconfirmed, but possible connection to Carter family. Daniel's hands trembled. His family. He looked up at Mrs. Thompson, his voice barely above a whisper. This means someone knew. Someone knew he was connected to me. The weight of the revelation hit him like a tidal wave. If Oliver was truly connected to his family, then why was he abandoned? Who left him here? And why did they never come back? But before he could process it all, Mrs. Thompson spoke again, her voice hesitant. There's something else you should know. Daniel braced himself. What is it? She hesitated, then pointed to another document in the folder. A few years ago, someone came looking for Oliver. Not the man in the photo, someone else. They asked a lot of questions about him, but when I pressed for details, they left and never returned. It was strange, like they didn't want to be noticed. Daniel's stomach twisted. Do you remember what they looked like? Mrs. Thompson frowned, thinking. A woman. She seemed nervous. She didn't give a name, but she kept asking if Oliver had ever been adopted. When I told her no, she seemed relieved. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. Someone had been keeping an eye on Oliver all these years. But why? And what were they afraid of? His mind raced with possibilities. If Oliver was abandoned by someone connected to his family, then that meant there were secrets, deep secrets, buried in his past, secrets someone didn't want him to uncover. And now that he had started digging, there was no turning back. That night, Daniel sat in his study, staring at the necklace in his hands. The same necklace his mother had worn every day of her life. The same necklace that now belonged to Oliver. If this boy was truly connected to him, then that meant everything he thought he knew about his past was a lie, and he was determined to find out the truth, no matter what it took. But as he sat there, lost in thought, he didn't notice the shadowy figure watching from outside his window, waiting, watching, as if they knew he was getting too close to the truth. Daniel had the unsettling feeling that he was being watched. Even as he sat in his study, staring at the necklace in his hand, the weight of everything he had discovered pressed heavily on his chest. Oliver wasn't just some orphan. He was connected to Daniel's past in a way he never could have imagined. And someone had been keeping that secret buried for years. The sound of a branch snapping outside made his pulse spike. He turned sharply toward the window, but by the time he reached it, there was nothing, only the rustling of leaves in the wind. His mind raced. Was he imagining things, or had someone really been there? The next morning, Daniel made a decision. He needed to know the truth, no matter what it uncovered. He took Oliver to a private DNA testing lab, unable to shake the feeling that they were connected by more than just coincidence. When the results came back, his hands trembled as he opened the envelope. A 99.9% match. Daniel stared at the paper, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Oliver wasn't just connected to him, he was his brother. His heart pounded as memories of his mother flooded back. Had she known? Had she kept this a secret from him all along? The thought was unbearable. And yet, if she had known, she would never have abandoned Oliver. Someone else had done that. Someone had taken him away. The puzzle pieces were finally starting to fit together. But one question remained. Who had left Oliver at the orphanage? And why? Determined to find answers, Daniel reached out to an old family friend, Mr. Reynolds, who had worked for his family years ago. When they met, the older man's face turned pale the moment Daniel mentioned Oliver. "You weren't supposed to find out," Mr. Reynolds whispered, looking around nervously. It was never meant to come to this. Daniel's stomach twisted. "Find out what?" he demanded. Mr. Reynolds sighed, his hands trembling. "Your mother had a second child. She never told anyone, not even you. But your uncle, he found out, and he wasn't happy." Daniel's blood ran cold. His uncle, Richard Carter, had always been a powerful and controlling man. He had fought Daniel for control of the family business after his mother passed away, but Daniel had won. He never trusted Richard, but he never imagined he was capable of something like this. "Why would he do this?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Reynolds looked down, shame written all over his face. "Your mother wanted to raise Oliver, but Richard thought a second heir would divide the family fortune. He saw Oliver as a threat. So, after your mother passed, he made him disappear." Daniel felt sick. His uncle had taken his own brother away, abandoned him at an orphanage, and erased him from the family, and all for greed. Fury burned inside him. He wasn't going to let this go. He confronted Richard that very night, storming into his estate with the DNA results in hand. The older man didn't even look surprised when Daniel shoved the paper in front of him. "You knew," Daniel said, his voice shaking with rage. "You knew all these years, and you did nothing. You left him to grow up alone." Richard sighed, setting down his drink. I did what was necessary, he said coldly. You were the rightful heir. Another son would have complicated things. Daniel clenched his fists, barely able to contain his anger. He's not just another son. He's my brother, Richard. Leaned back in his chair, unfazed. And now what? You found him. Good for you. What do you plan to do about it? Daniel's heart pounded. But then, for the first time in his life, he felt completely clear-headed. He had always believed that money and power could fix anything. But now he saw the truth. Family was what mattered. Not wealth, not business, and certainly not the opinions of a bitter old man. I'm taking him home, Daniel said firmly. And I'm making sure you never get to hurt him again. Richard laughed bitterly. You think you can change the past? No, Daniel said, staring him dead in the eye. But I can make sure Oliver has the future he deserves. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Richard in stunned silence. A few weeks later, Daniel legally adopted Oliver as his brother. He made sure Oliver had everything he had missed out on: a home, a family, a future. But more than that, he gave him something money couldn't buy: love. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Oliver turned to Daniel, his necklace still hanging around his neck. Do you think Mom knew we'd find each other? He asked softly. Daniel smiled, feeling a warmth he hadn't felt in years. I think she always believed we would. And in that moment, he knew. No matter what had happened in the past, they had each other now. And that was all that truly mattered. The secrets, the lies, the betrayal. None of it could change the fact that family always finds its way back together.